Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to engage with all of you on these enormously important, complicated, and urgent and timely issues. I especially appreciate the opportunity to sneak into this, and I just have to say, just really beautiful space here. I'm so impressed with the whole campus. This is my first visit to the barracks. But also just this facility, really, really lovely. And I've just been so impressed with how smoothly everything is run. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity as a lawyer to sneak into this space and talk with all of you, learn with all of you. I maybe was able to do that because I had a career doing defense policy, legislation, intel, things like that before I became a law professor. But something I do as a law professor is a lot of comparative work, and trying to emphasize to my students and to people who read my writing that understanding the law and our country's legal structures and processes is much the richer for the more we take a comparative and multidisciplinary and multi-institution approach. And so in that context, it's especially gratifying for me to engage with the colleagues such as we have on our panel today who have so much expertise and can bring so much insight to the issues that we're going to talk about. Our panel is going to focus on industry, technology, and modern war in the context of our broader conversation about civil-military relations. And to help us explore these issues, we have just again a fantastic group of colleagues. So working our way down the panel, we have Dr. Dvid Burbach from the Naval War College. He's Associate Professor of National Security Affairs and Director of the Space Studies Group. He holds a PhD in political science from MIT and has research interests in the politics of defense policy and the intersection of technology and international security, particularly outer space issues. Dr. Nora Bensahel of Jons Hopkins SAIS is a professor at SAIS and has a leading role in their PME program. She's a contributing editor to War on the Rocks, which if you don't read it, I'm going to wonder why in this room such as this. You really should. In her teaching and her writing, she focuses on the future of warfare, military strategy, and operations. She serves on a number of boards, including for, as I understand it, the Army War College and LC-WINS, the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. And to my immediate right is Dr. Doug Winton of the Eisenhower War College, and newly renamed, as we were mentioning, formerly the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, now the Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy at the National Defense University in Washington. In addition to teaching military strategy and economics, Doug leads student research examining the industry that produces ground combat systems. His research focuses primarily, but not exclusively, on urban warfare. So again, a lot of terrific expertise overlapping, but also different areas of interest that I think are going to be very, very helpful for us in exploring the issues that we're going to look at today. We're going to approach this as we have in our other sessions as a conversation. We're going to work in a dynamic way through a number of different issues and then leave a good amount of time for Q&A. So we look forward to your engagement on the issues. We all are in practical terms situated in our present moment. For our discussion, we're going to start there as well. And that's the context of two fairly intense armed conflicts and some lesser intense but ongoing ones. So we're going to start talking about Ukraine and Gaza. We might reference ongoing counterterror operations, but really in our first part of our discussion here, we're going to focus mainly on Ukraine and Gaza. So I'd just like to kick this off with a question for our panel about thinking about the intersection of technology, modern war, the industry component of it, and civil-military relations. What are big lessons and takeaways to date of the Ukraine war?
I think we agreed I would chime in first on that. Before I do, I should clarify that I don't have a leading role in the PME programs at Johns Hopkins. As many of you know, the Space Force has established its PME programs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. This is something we can talk about a bit more. I had students from the Space Force program in my classes this past year, but I don't play any role in overseeing it. So the question that you posed about, what are some of the lessons from Ukraine and Gaza that we can, think about industry and particularly from a civil military perspective? Obviously, there's lots of lessons we could take across, all sorts of different aspects of those conflicts. But one of the ones that I think will be most transformative and that I've focused on quite a bit in my own work is the drone revolution and what it means that we now have what I've started referring to really as a new subdomain of warfare in the air littoral. This is a way of thinking about things in the air that really has never been an issue before. It borrows from the naval concept of the littoral, right? The part of the sea that is around land. Close into land. When we've thought about the air domain in warfare, yes, there have been lots and lots and lots of helicopters, but mostly you think about jets, bombers, things that the Air Force flies at altitude. But what we've really seen in these wars, first in Ukraine and then really very dramatically in Gaza, is that the airspace between 0 feet and 10,000 feet is incredibly contested with swarms and swarms of drones. That, I think, has a really transformational effect on how wars are being fought. Right now, if you look at Ukraine, for example, President Zelensky wants to have 1 million drones built in Ukraine this year and wants another 1 million drones to be donated essentially by Western partners. That's because they're losing 10,000 of them a month. Okay, so, we've talked for many years about the need for US forces to have a capability that is cheap and expendable. Well, this is what is needed, right? When you look at those numbers in Ukraine, where you see again, in the war in Gaza, just how dramatic that is. To put that in some perspective, the Replicator Initiative, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, last year announced the Replicator Initiative that was designed to build cheaper systems much more quickly. The goal for that program, and I'm quoting her here, was to build, quote, thousands of drones in an 18 to 24-month period. Right? Not to take anything away from that initiative, I think it's the right kind of idea, but it just shows how far away we are from the possibility of having low-cost drones at scale that we could need in order to be able to fight what is now this increasingly contested airspace. This is no longer theoretical about how it will harm US forces. In January, the attack on Tower 22 in the Middle East that many of you may have read about was the first time since April of 1953 that the US had ground troops die from an air attack. It was the first time that US air supremacy, air superiority had failed in 70 years. So, we're seeing how this is going to transform things, but the Department of Defense is not ready. Industry is not ready. I was talking with a friend who went to a defense industrial conference, for lack of a better word, who had made some of these similar points before and had a industry representative from a company that shall remain unnamed come up to him and say, you should be so excited. We finally have a drone that we can sell for only $750,000. Right? That's the scale of the problem that we're dealing with industry. It's a combination of what industry is able to develop and what is they have incentives to develop in terms of costs. It's a problem with the demand signal from the services. A separate question is, why is the Replicator Initiative necessary to be initiated by the Deputy Secretary of Defense? The answer is the services are not moving fast enough, which are the organizations that should be moving very quickly on this in their responsibility to organize, train, and equip. But I fear that we are terribly behind what, the US has the good fortune of learning from 2 tragic battlefields about what the changing character of war looks like. And I'm extremely concerned that we're nowhere near prepared for the lessons of what those wars should be teaching us.
So what would a stronger signal look like than the replicator initiative?
I think you need the services to commit to long-term programs to buy cheaper unmanned drones. But there are lots of reasons why the services don't do this. I will call out the Army as actually being the service that is most in front of dealing with this. They've actually made some tough decisions, including canceling a reconnaissance aircraft, which had already cost $2 billion because they recognize it's no longer survivable. They've canceled some of their drone programs. They are trying to shift towards more cheaper expendable ones. The real service problem here, to be brutally honest, is the Air Force, which is so tied in. The concept of the pilot is so central to Air Force culture that the Air Force has done virtually nothing to, I shouldn't say it's done virtually nothing, but everything that it has done about drones has involved ones that have large capabilities. It has done virtually nothing about small, relatively cheap mass-produced drones. And I think it's organizationally incapable of doing so because of that fundamental threat to what it sees as its fundamental service culture.
Which is a significant change from the 1990s, for example, and the early 2000s when the Air Force was, with Predator and with Global Hawk, right? They were driving that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to expand on Nora's point that the students whose research I'm helping supervise this semester, their specific research question is, what would it take for the Army's robotic combat vehicle to be a candidate for the replicator initiative? Can we get in the land domain in ground combat the same sort of scale, autonomy, attritable, affordable systems that each of the services is nominating in the air domain or the air littoral, as Nora put it. And they haven't finished their report. I'm hoping it's going to be well worth everybody's read. But one of the key themes that they've talked about is the lack of a coherent concept and the lack of detailed requirements is one of the main inhibitors to getting the scale of production and the reliable demand signal that industry is asking for. Industry is eager to produce. They need a consistent demand signal to do that. The consistent demand signal can only come if there's consistent funding. And Congress is reluctant to fund things that just look interesting. There's not a demonstrated, there's not a clear logical thought process about how this capability is going to lead to better outcomes. To the broader question of what's worth learning about warfare in Ukraine, in the ground domain, the challenge of maneuver is a clear one. Forces are having a harder time conducting coherent maneuver across the battlefield. And that is, the Army, I do agree, is looking very aggressively. Can autonomous systems help solve this maneuver problem? But until they get that fleshed out well with clear concepts and clear requirements, we're not going to see the scale of production that's going to bring about a real solution.
David, would you like to add?
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a very quick observation from Gaza and then a couple of points about Ukraine. The very quick one that I'll make about Gaza and dealing with the Houthis is I'm of an age to remember when missile defense was one of the biggest debates out there. And what we've seen with the success of missile defense with the recent Iranian strikes or against, actually, I guess a Houthi missile was the first actual in-space intercept. I think we're likely to see more interest in talking about national missile defense again. It's not clear that those technical successes translate, but I think we're, I already see missile defense advocates gearing up to really make much of that. But some more detailed points on Ukraine. Two positive, and two challenges. First of all, Ukraine has really proven itself to be a fight where space matters, and in particular, where commercial space capabilities are now providing militarily useful information and intelligence to to the combatants. In particular, Ukraine has been relying on SpaceX's Starlink service for tactical communications. They have what they sometimes call Uber for Artillery, a GIS ARTA application that distributes fire control, where literally units will, on something like a cell phone, say, I can take that fire mission, we can service that target. They have a very distributed control system that really has depended upon having a tactical internet, which they've obtained from space, but also able to obtain useful intelligence from commercial satellites. The quality of images, not only optical, but there are now commercial synthetic aperture radar satellites. I know we saw, after Israel strikes on the Iranian airbase a couple of weeks ago, within hours, one of the commercial providers had some pretty detailed SAR images that let open source analysts do some pretty detailed bomb damage assessment. Ukraine is able to make use of that. I know we have been providing them. We've contracted to provide them with some services and help with analysis. So we've reached a point where commercial satellite technology is of direct tactical military value these days. And a good news story, this is an area where U.S. industry actually looks pretty good relative to the rest of the world. We're able to put out, Starlink can manufacture SpaceX can manufacture satellites more rapidly than anybody else. We have a pretty thriving sector of other new entrants into the space arena. Planet Labs has a constellation of several hundred imaging satellites that will image every point on Earth at least a couple of times a day. Russia is not in this game at all. Even the Chinese companies are not as competitive. So this is actually a relatively strong area for the U.S. A couple of challenges that I think Ukraine illustrates, though. First of all, relying on commercial services means you are as vulnerable as commercial services. And Ukraine learned this early in the war, where on day one, Ukraine relied on a provider called Viasat. Not Starlink, actually, before the war started. Day one of the war, Russia launched a cyber attack against Viasat terminals that completely took away Ukraine's ability to use them, and also took away this service from thousands of customers in Western Europe, NATO countries. SpaceX was able to step up. If SpaceX were not doing as well fending off Russian state-sponsored cyber attacks, this might be a very different story. So by relying on the commercial sector, we bring in vulnerabilities that they may have. And we have to think about, what do we do to protect them? What do we owe them in threat analysis? How should we be structuring to make sure that commercial providers are able to meet our security needs? It also raises an interesting challenge. I guess here I will credit Elon Musk for crystallizing some potential concerns in a very dramatic way. You may have seen that Musk has actually imposed restrictions on where and how Starlink can be used. They've said, for example, they can't use Starlink in weaponized drones, and otherwise want to limit where it can be used, whether it can be used in weapons or not. And of course, Musk himself has frequently opined on what a Ukrainian-Russian settlement ought to look like. This is a little unusual for DoD. We're not really used to defense CEOs having such a public presence and opining on what U.S. policy ought to be. Musk is even, there are even credible reports that he's talked to Vladimir Putin, about thoughts on Ukraine. So dealing with a commercial sector where, and I think this is true for many of the Silicon Valley firms interested in drones and other things as well, are more willing to have a more visible, even brash public image, more willing to talk about politics. And for DoD to deal with companies that kind of really put themselves out there like that is kind of a new and slightly uncomfortable position for us.
I'd like to add something quick on that, although all of those points are excellent. Your point about missile defense, I'm of the same generation. I remember that debate. I think it's coming back too. But what we're seeing now, even though we're being quite successful, although, we have to, we can't assume we're always going to be successful, but we've been quite good at, destroying some of the missiles being, some of the threats being launched at us. the cost curve does not favor us,
Mhm.
right? We are spending, depending on the munition, between $1 million to $10 million each every time we try to shoot down one of those threats. Now, if you're a combatant commander, and I've heard combatant commanders say this, they will say, I don't care about the costs, we're saving American lives, and that's what we need to do. And if I were a combatant commander, I would feel the exact same way. But as a strategist and analyst, you have to think about the defense budget. Right? And you get into some real civil military issues. We don't usually think of them that way. When you think about how much the American public is going to continue to, through their representatives in Congress, are going to continue to support high defense budgets. Right now, most Americans have a sense we spend a lot on defense, but defense is 15% of the overall federal budget, and it's 50% of the discretionary budget. That's the part that Congress fights over every year. That's only 30% of the overall budget, by the way. If you really want to have a discussion about the budget, you need to be talking about Social Security and Medicare. But since Congress isn't going to do that, I won't either. We'll sort of set that aside. So the discretionary part is what everybody fights over every year. It is, the defense budget is enormously large, yet because of internal cost growth and other issues, the capability it's buying is going down every year. Even though the dollars are going up, the capabilities are going down. We can't get ahead of that dynamic. And so you really do have to stop and say, how are we going to continue when drones pose these threats? When, how do you do a missile defense? Even if we don't go to a total national missile defense system, how long can you afford to keep spending that kind of money on systems which it's costing the Houthis not a whole lot of money to send up at us?
So I love the mention of the defense budget. As a former Senate Budget Committee staffer who handled in that world it's called 050.
Yeah.
If you know, that's the national defense budget. We're getting to a point now where the interest that we pay on the debt is now equaling roughly the defense budget, which is a remarkable thing. And that's the heritage of the last 25 years. I mean, when I was on the Senate Budget Committee, we had a federal budget surplus. I left to go become a lawyer, and we can see what happened.
Yeah, it's your fault. It's all your fault.
We had 25 years of 2 wars that were put on the credit cards. Many rounds of tax cuts, expansion of Medicare benefits, and the more you put on your credit card, right, it builds debt, and that builds larger interest payments. So that's a context we're running into. And is operating in the context of something really, really interesting that I think that we're talking about here, where we're seeing in a number of different domains that the cost of defending against something, right, seems to be outstripping the cost for the attacker, right? So with missile defense, right, a cheapo missile is fired, and we're spending, we're sending a really expensive interceptor to go after that, right? You've got drones up in the air, and many of the missiles that are being fired to take down these cheapo drones, again, the missile is much more expensive. You look in the cyber realm, right? Think about all the money that the United States spends on cyber defense. How expensive U.S. Cybercom is, NSA, and contrast that with the amount of effort that goes into one person or a small number of people launching a cyber attack, right? I'd love to hear more from our panel about that dynamic and its civil-military relations, right? And what we're learning from this war and looking on ahead. And any additional thoughts on that kind of that cost dynamic that we're seeing?
Well, there's one place where it goes the other way, and that is a Javelin missile is really inexpensive compared to a tank. And so, but this whole idea of, what capability are we buying and what is that capability going to do for us is the issue that underpins all of this. I agree very strongly with Nora. You can't think about these as discrete engagements. Not if we believe that warfare is going to have a protracted nature to it. If your vision of warfare is wars can be fought very short, discrete, decisive, then you would draw on a different set of capabilities. And I think that was a large part of our narrative for an extended period of time. We wouldn't have to fight a peer. If we did have to fight a peer, we'd win it very quickly. I think for very good reasons, we're beginning to question those basic assumptions, accept the fact that wars will have to be fought in protracted ways. So magazine depth really matters. How much you have in reserve really matters. And how much you're spending and how much capability are you getting for what you spend really, really matters. And so, to extend what we've been saying about what can we see from Ukraine or from Gaza, this challenge of ground maneuver is one of them. So every formation that is moving has to move with the presumption that it's being seen and observed. That capability has proliferated across all battlefields, and so that is creating the incentives to invest more in these sort of small, discrete capabilities that can effectively and quickly target things that are moving, and that is changing the dynamic in a serious way.
So very quick, I want to go somewhere with that, but very quickly, Nora.
Well, I was going to say the question that you asked was essentially, does the dynamics that I described, is that now making the offense dominant? I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, but is it giving an advantage to the offensive? And I think the answer is actually much more complicated than that. I think it actually ends up probably, the trends that we're seeing end up being a wash. They end up negating each other. So it is true that it is becoming a lot easier to attack things, right? You can send drones, you can send longer range missiles, so you can do that. So the offensive does have an advantage in that, particularly if you have lots of cheap drones that you can send, a little more expensive ones for longer range, but still. However, the defense also, you have to assume, has lots of drones and capabilities. And we saw this done, especially in the early weeks of the Ukraine war, extremely well. They use drones not so much for lethal capacity, but for reconnaissance and communication in a way that enabled the Ukrainians to suffer really disastrous strikes on the Russian military that paralyzed it and were one of the reasons, there were many reasons, that blunted their move towards Kiev and gave the Ukrainians such an advantage in the first 6 months of the war. So in many ways, you can argue that the defense is now dominant because those trends sort of cancel each other out, if you will. What is clear, even if you go beyond missile defense and you get it down to the more tactical level now, is you need greater protection for your forces. This is something that the US military has not invested in. This is something the US Army has not invested in. My writing partner, retired Lieutenant General Dave Barnell, and I wrote a piece in 2016 called The Military's Protection Deficit Disorder, which talked about how we need to be able to defend tactically against these kinds of things. Being mobile on the battlefield is part of that, right? Because the more you mass, the more visible you are, so you need to hide and disperse, but you also need some no-kidding protection capabilities, and that is an Army, primarily an Army need, and the Army is not doing great at that.
Yeah, just in the space domain, in some ways, we've been trying to make that kind of calculation work for us, because the big change that's been happening in space is the move towards large numbers of relatively small and cheap satellites. And it takes about the same sort of interceptor to shoot down a small satellite as a big satellite. So if we're presenting the Russians or the Chinese with SpaceX, for example, I think they're up to about 5,500 satellites in their communications constellation right now. The Russians do not have 5,500 anti-satellite missiles. They probably have dozens. And it would cost them a tremendous amount to try and build that many. We might respond to that by spending a ton of money building really high-tech interceptors. This is where, if you remember the news from earlier this year, Russia considering a nuclear weapon, anti-satellite weapon. Adversaries faced with this challenge may not respond the way we might, which is, somewhat symmetrically spend a ton of money to develop some really capable weapons. Russia seems to be signaling, if we get angry enough about your, cute little satellite constellations, we'll set off nukes in space and take out thousands of them at a time. Or it also highlights the importance of the cyber realm, where in fact they were able to take away Ukraine's Viasat capability, or the Viasat service for Ukraine with a single cyber attack. They didn't need to shoot down any satellites.
So in our conversation here, we're touching on the next two things that I want to focus on for a bit. So one of them is looking beyond the armed conflicts which are currently waging, but looking at potential conflicts with Russia and with China, and then I want to go from there and talk a little bit more about space in particular. But so transitioning from what we're talking about, the lessons learned from the Ukraine war to date and the Gaza war to date, and what we've been talking about, relative strength of attack and defense, relative costs of those things. Should we be thinking about potential armed conflict with Russia, a NATO-Russia war, potential conflict with China in the context of Taiwan or the South China Sea? Should we be thinking about those primarily through the lens of the lessons we're learning from the Ukraine war or the Gaza war, or are there other lessons, and what are the implications of those for tech and industry and civil military relations? Thoughts on that? Are we thinking about this in the right way?
With Ukraine in particular, I would be cautious translating lessons to a China conflict, because I think the Chinese military is better than the Russian military. An anecdote I've used with respect to space on the civilian side, China, you may see news this morning, launched their 4th lander to go to the moon and retrieve samples and bring it back. Russia has had a 100% failure rate with their civilian space probes going out to the planets or the moon since the 1980s. China has had a 100% success rate on the first try of very ambitious missions. Now, that may or may not translate to the military, but it suggests to me they kind of, not only are they building quality stuff, they know how to operate it well. So I would, in some of these high-tech realms, I don't, areas where we have seen Russia weak, I wouldn't necessarily assume the Chinese are weak. Although I would also say, it's not like they've been doing carrier battle group operations for, there are a lot of things about a big combined arms operation that they just don't have practice in the way we have. So I realize it's a kind of a wishy-washy on the one hand, on the other hand.
So let me just follow up on that, right? I mean, so what you're getting at is, I think, a key part of the conversation among national security experts about China, which is they have all these amazing toys. They've been performing really, really well. They've got more and more and more of them, right? But the Chinese armed forces have not been involved in combat on any significant degree since 1979, right? I mean, that was a completely different, PLA than what exists today. So to what extent, could tech be mitigating this?
I suspect it's, I would assume there's a lot that, it's hard doing big, complicated military maneuvers. We know, there has got to, the fact that they are a fairly repressive communist system probably matters somehow. We like to, in terms of the quality of their military decision making. I often joke that when I'm having a bad DoD bureaucracy day, I like to joke that I can only assume it's worse in a communist country than it is for us in DoD. They probably have to deal with even more than we do. I sure hope that's the case. It seems plausible. This is getting far enough out of what I know that I don't want to speculate too much on PLA capabilities to use their technology. But I think that's a really important question.
Go ahead, please.
Well, so I'll try and pick up on this point that Dave's talking about, because whatever we would say about future war, the one thing we know is we'll be wrong. Right? The future war will be different than we think it's going to be today.
That's like economists, they're always wrong, right?
So what do we care about when it comes to building military capability? For my money, I bet on adaptability. I think that's the characteristic that most indicates successful military capability, is a unit, an organization that knows how to adapt. And I think this is tied back to the really important point that Risa was making earlier about dissent. Because units that know how to adapt, organizations that know how to adapt, know that they're wrong. So somebody has to be able to say, hey, what we're doing isn't working, we need to do something different. I think that's a really, really important characteristic. I would also say, if I was going to make one other bet, I'd bet on the fact that we're going to have to fight with dispersed formations. This is a point that Nora was making before. We're going to have to fight small and dispersed. I think there's a number of factors that are leading to that, which means we're going to have to be able to talk. So when we think about the role of our military services and the way they interact with industry and procuring equipment, I really don't think we want the Army to have a big vote on what kind of ship we build next. I don't think we want the Air Force to have a big vote on what kind of tank we build next. But when we talk about our ability to communicate, that feels to me like a place where we really need some sort of joint procurement that I don't see happening right now. Because we absolutely want all these things to be able to talk to one another. And in my mind, that's a joint level of procurement for communications, command and control capabilities that I think the vice chairman is currently struggling to get that JADC2 system built because of the way we're structured.
So you gave me the perfect opportunity to plug my book. Thank you for that. As I mentioned, my writing partner, Dave Barno, and I published a book in 2020 about the need for military adaptation called Adaptation Under Fire, which looked at the factors that make militaries adaptable, looked at the US record of adaptability in Iraq and Afghanistan, spoiler alert, not where it needed to be. And then made some policy recommendations about how to improve adaptability in the US military. One of the frequent bits of pushback we got, and I will, no one said it exactly like this, but I will paraphrase it, was, oh yeah, if we're not so good at that, who's better in the world? Right? Which is a legitimate question. And my answer until February 2022 actually was nobody, we're still the best. Now my answer is the Ukrainians. But we're still better than that than Russia or China. They have problems with that. But the issue is the US needs to be adaptable to a whole lot more scenarios than either of those countries, or because we're not just looking at them, right? If you're Vladimir Putin, you know where your current war is, but if the war expands, it's going to be in NATO, right? He's not, setting foot in Taiwan, right? If you're China, it's in your neighborhood. You're going to be, trying to take on US forces there. If you're the United States, even if we're assuming that it's going to be a great power conflict, we have to prepare for both Russia and China at the same time. But of course, that's not all of the conflict spectrum. We also have to worry about states like North Korea and Iran. And we have to still take into account violent extremist organizations. And the possibilities of war, the likelihood actually of war erupting in places we never considered before. So thank you for allowing me to foot stomp that, because you cannot possibly prepare for all of those things at once. I sometimes worry that we're falling into a little bit of the lesser included contingency myth that we believed during the 1990s, that if we were prepared for large conventional war, we could do anything else on the conflict spectrum. That idea was profoundly disproven by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were not prepared. So I think that's something that's extremely important to think about. Quickly on Russia and China and weighing them, I think most parallels and comparisons between them are not particularly helpful, partly because I think China's military is much more capable than Russia's, partly because you have to be thinking primarily of Europe, a Europe contingency as primarily land, whereas the Asia Pacific is maritime and air, which make very, very different dynamics, of course. But the one comparison, the one lesson I think that China would be smart to be learning from Russia dates back to literally to the invasion, which is, if you're going to invade, do it quickly and win it soon. Which is what I think the Russians intended to do, but have now found themselves, because frankly, there were reasons why they botched that. Authoritarian governments can do lots of things better in terms of mobilizing industry and such, but they're also more prone to strategic disaster because there are no competing ideas. So that was certainly a factor. But if I'm Xi Jinping and I'm looking at trying to take over Taiwan, the lesson I'm going to learn is do it fast and do it well.
Very, very well taken point. just to wrap up our conversation about great powers and potential conflicts with them, in preparing for our panel, we had some very interesting conversations about where American industry is and the support of Congress as part of that to produce the material that would be necessary for one of these wars or both of these wars. And what emerged from those conversations was we have impressive space capabilities, especially in the private sector, but in some fairly traditional things, we probably don't have everything we need. Would you like to expand on that general thought? Any of you? Yeah, Doug.
Well, just trying to extend the point I was hoping to make before. If future war is protracted war, there's no question, right? China, take the lesson. Let's win wars short, sharp, quick. There's not great historic track record of that happening. I don't think we can bet on that. I mean, we certainly don't want to bet that China wins fast and we lose fast, right? So what are the scenarios that where the political object is so valuable to us that we would engage in a long-term protracted war? There's no question the industrial base right now is not set for that. To what degree should the United States be investing in building that capability? It's an intensely political question about how you weigh the benefits and the risks. But by any objective analysis, just observing the amount of time it has taken the United States and its industrial base to increase its 155 production, as Carrie was talking about before, that's a pretty good tell that we don't have the industrial capacity today that would sustain us through a protracted conflict.
I mean, I think we've been hearing this theme all day that this is not a great political era for getting things rationally done. I mean, you can talk about we need to do more to reform and improve the defense industrial base, and then if you're going to have a continuing resolution for 6 months and create all that uncertainty, it's very difficult to get agreement on things right now. And I know right now, some of you may know, there's an effort underway to reform PPBE, the budgeting and planning process. Where I'll admit I'm something of a skeptic on that process, and partly because when you look, a lot of the recommendations come down to Congress needs to stop being Congress. Members need to give more authority to DoD. They need to be willing to make future commitments. I mean, even outside of our polarized times, the Constitution says it's Congress's job to fund and provide for the military, and they are not unreasonably, not contrary to the way our system is supposed to work, they're very jealous of those prerogatives. And a lot of the ways we could be more efficient would be Congress gives DoD $1 trillion to spend over the next few years, and DoD just figures out what to do. They're very disinclined to do that. Now, I don't say that believing that DoD would make perfect, brilliant decisions with that $1 trillion. But I think it's just putting on my political scientist hat, this is a really tough problem to get out of. Even putting aside all the ways that DoD is messy, these are tremendously big resource decisions with implications not only for how much we all pay in taxes, but the distributional implications of specific congressional districts. So I think it's really hard to try and run defense procurement the way a successful business would buy things. It's difficult.
Does anyone want to push back on the idea of Congress just giving the Pentagon $1 trillion?
Well, I think every member of Congress would push back on that.
I'd hope so.
I'm not saying that I think DoD would use it well, but relative to maybe we'll have a budget, maybe we won't. I'm not advocating that. I'm just.
I think you're right. At this point, the DoD would settle for getting its money on time. Not having this endless parade of continuing resolutions. The damage that is doing to military readiness that
That's
is completely, it's an unforced error, right? Congress has inflicted this upon the Department of Defense for reasons that have nothing to do with defense, right? This is all about larger political debates. I find that, horrible what the consequences have been for the Defense Department.
Yeah, I'll know on the Navy side, a particular issue has been shipyard workforces, where even though we've been putting significantly more money into shipbuilding, apparently not many kids want to be welders these days, and it actually, it's a very skilled job, and there aren't a lot of civilian equivalents because we basically don't have a civilian shipbuilding industry. The degree to which companies are willing to really, train and develop, keep busy or just keep employed even when work is low, without knowing, what decades were, without being confident that they've got many years worth of work lined up, they're pretty loath to do the workforce development necessary. That then makes the shipyards more expensive and more inefficient in the short term. So it creates a really negative cycle.
It's a super interesting issue. One of the privileges I have in this research that we do, we visit a lot of firms, both in the United States and overseas, and the Europeans approach the problem very, very differently. So young European students, at least in Germany and Austria, the two countries that we visited, it's decided pretty early on if you're going to go to university or not. If you're not going to university, you finish your 3 high school years in a firm, in a company, you get your education, but you get embedded in that company and walk out with some very basic skills that then the company hones once you finish graduating. But their apprenticeship program has helped them solve that portion of the problem. What was interesting when we visited firms in Germany and Austria is them talking about the hard time they had keeping their employees, not just because of the defense budget cycle, and so defense firms weren't having enough money to keep enough jobs, but a societal stigma of working for a defense company, that was a low person's work, not the job itself of welding, but the company that you would do it for. And I do think that it is something that U.S. firms didn't talk about that at all. They didn't have any problems recruiting people to be in their workforce other than, are you going to pay me well?
So on this people space that you've gotten us to, which is a very important one, this is a perfect transition to talking about space and about cyber and how we organize to do space and cyber. As you're all well aware, we have a Space Force. As you're all, I'm sure, well aware as well, there's been conversation in recent years asking, do we need a cyber force as well within the armed forces? And this is a bureaucratic matter. This concerns budget and procurement. But ultimately, what we're talking about is how we organize humans, how we organize people, right? Starting a brief conversation here about domain-specific military services. I'd like to start with this question of, to what extent does the pool of people in the country at large, right, in our civic culture across the country, right, who are the people that you want to be doing space and cyber stuff, right, to what extent to get them, right, does having a space force and perhaps a cyber force make sense, or does that not really have any sort of relationship there? Nora.
I've written on this, so I have no problem talking about this publicly. I co-authored a column in, I think it was 2016 or 2017, that said we need a new cyber force as a separate service, right? All the debate back then was about Space Force yes, Space Force no. I'll be frank, at that time I was not really convinced of the merits of a separate Space Force. I do actually think it's been a really good thing now that I've seen it. But I think the case for an independent cyber force makes the argument about a separate space force, it's so much more important in the cyber domain than it even has been in the space domain. Part of that is you need to have in the way that DoD is structured, you need to have a service advocate for this. Let me say up front, to clarify, I'm talking about a cyber force that would do strategic level cyber. Cyber is always going to be a part of tactical operations. The Army should still have cyber units that can work at the tactical level with units in battle, but I'm talking about from a broader national strategic perspective. You don't want those kinds of operations to be the responsibility of any one of the existing services, because it will always be a second thought, right? The Army is about war on land. The Air Force is about the air. Cyber is not a physical domain. There's no one else who can think about it in that way. This idea had all sorts of people push back against it, of course. Part of the reason is why do you need a whole separate bureaucratic service to do it? And there I think the main reasons do come back to the people reasons. And this of course ties into the recruiting crisis, talent management more broadly, which isn't just about how do you bring in the numbers of people, but what do you do with them when you get them and make sure they get into the right positions. You need to have a separate cyber service precisely because all of the people who have those skills do not need to meet the same physical requirements as the other services. Again, if you're going to be involved in Army tactical cyber, you sure better meet the same physical standards, and you better be able to do whatever that unit is doing, because you have to be right there with them. But again, at a strategic level, at the national level, you're going to be behind a keyboard. You're not crawling under barbed wire. Right? And so this has often been described, going back to a debate in War on the Rocks with someone who used this example about whether people with blue hair should be allowed to serve in the military. That's become the shorthand for all the people who don't meet all of the standard military eligibility requirements. And the case for it in the cyber domain is very, very clear. If you're not going to be in physical combat, you need to be, it doesn't matter if you care to work between midnight and 8 a.m. or if you survive on a diet of Doritos, right? You're probably, if you have the skill set to do that in offensive cyber, which is something that only the government can do in the United States, you want to attract those people and bring them in.
Mm-hmm. So that's a strong case. Let me outline a number of potential alternatives to a new cyber force, and we'll see what our expert colleagues have to think about these. So one is addressing the concern about, well, we're going to create a new bureaucratic entity, right? The cyber force, and it's going to have headquarters, and you have to have all you have to have a new flag and new uniforms, and all this stuff, right? So why don't we have a combined space and cyber force? That's alternative number one to just a cyber force. Alternative number two. Give the cyber mission, the strategic cyber mission, right? Just give it to one service. Do the same. You could even do the same with space, right? Collapse space back into one of the existing services. This idea, some of the roots of this, some of the ideas in the mid-1990s about restructuring the U.S. armed forces were saying, let's take these service activities that the military forces do, like medical, right? Comms, legal, logistics, right? And just take that entire one, give it to one service, right? And they do it for all the other services. That's idea number two. We just hand cyber to one of the current military services. Alternative number three, we have a civilian cyber force. And examples of this, Estonia created basically a cyber militia, mostly civilian. The state where I work right now, Ohio has created the Ohio Cyber Reserve. It answers to the adjutant general in the state, but is a civilian force that assists government in the state of Ohio with cybersecurity. So are those better alternatives? Are they worse?
Can I propose a fourth?
Okay.
So my proposal would be that we give Cyber Command service-like authorities, as we've done with Special Operations Command. And I would have put the genie back in the bottle, done with same with Space Command, give them service-like authorities. But I think Nora's point is very well taken about getting the right people into that service with the right skills and the right requirements. In the case of Special Operations Forces, they need more exquisite physical requirements, and they need more exquisite assessments to get in there. If we were to give Cyber Command that same authority and let them acquire that workforce in a unique way from the services with perhaps relaxed physical standards, relaxed hair color standards, perhaps, I think you could address many of the problems that Nora is so right to point out. I'll just admit I'm a bit concerned about the proliferation of combatant commands and the proliferation of services. There's a lot of goodness in the necessary matrixed approach to solving the nation's problems. I think a lot of goodness comes from that. But there is eventually there's a span of control problem. I think we have too many combatant commands. So anyway, just thinking about what should that matrix actually look like? I think that I think the special operations model offers a lot to draw from.
So David and Nora, what do you think about these alternatives to a cyber force?
Doug, actually, I think that was the fifth option, but you stole exactly what I was going to bring up too. In fact, I think during the Space Force debate, if you had done a poll of DC policy wonks, I think there would have been a lot of support for the SOCOM for space. Make Space Command a 4-star, give it some Title X authorities. I was in the camp that thought a whole new service brings so much bureaucratic overhead, and you've got so many billets at so many joint commands that a service is supposed to fill relative to the actual size of what a Space Force or what a cyber force would look like, that you end up overburdening the force, meeting all kinds of bureaucratic requirements, or you spend years dealing with uniforms and challenge coins and songs, and I mean, now all the stuff we expect a service to have. I will say I'm the more I learn about how the Air Force dealt with space, the better I'm feeling about Space Force as a separate service. So I think the argument of give it to a service is often pretty difficult unless that really matches up well with what one of the services already did. One counter argument to the service idea, though, is also on the blue hair point, the argument of having a separate service that can set its own rules, tailor its to the mission. That assumes that DoD lets it do that, and we are really good at not letting anybody be different. Some of you may know Southcom and AFRICOM both wanted to experiment with getting away from a J-code organization. Southcom actually did it. We think it makes sense for us. And within a couple of years, they had to change back because a 4-star from the Pentagon would call and say, I need to talk to the J35 shop. And they'd say, we don't have a J35. And the 4-star would say, I don't like being annoyed. Get a J35 shop. And so the degree to which we'll actually let a service, especially if it doesn't have its own department, which is its own overhead, will we actually do that? Space Force has had some interesting ideas about doing its personnel systems very differently. I'm not sure the institution writ large is going to let, especially if it's my service wants to do something cool and get away, from a traditional way of doing it that everybody else hates. The other services are going to want to grind them down and make them do it the unpleasant way. I apologize if I sound cynical, but 20 years of being a political scientist in DoD will do that to you.
Nora.
I'm going to push back on the idea of a sort of a SOCOM model for this. But first, I want to push back against the idea of civilianizing it altogether, which is, I think, one that comes up often. I think that it is vital that if we have people who are, again, what we're talking about when we talk about DoD strategic level cyber is offensive operations, right, which does not exist in the private sector. Lots of defensive specialties and appropriately in the private sector.
Doesn't legally exist in the private sector.
Well, correct. Yes, there are no firms that are engaged in this. Hackers are a different story. But it is vital for two reasons that you want the people who conduct offensive cyber operations on behalf of the United States to be in uniform. The first is they need to be combatants under international law. And the second is you need them for accountability purposes to be under the UCMJ. period, full stop. They need to, that's why they need to be members of the military. If, to the extent that you're doing network defensive things, yes, you can contract that out. This may not be a whole lot of people we're talking about. This is not hundreds of thousands of people, but those people who are doing offensive cyber missions need to be members of the military for those two reasons. I am not convinced by this SOCOM model for two reasons. The first is that it depends on those people getting through the services in the first place, right? SOCOM draws, they do very little direct, people coming directly into SOCOM. Now, part of that is because you need more, a bit more maturity and expertise for SOCOM. I would argue the same is probably true if you're going to be conducting offensive cyber missions. You don't necessarily want an 18-year-old off the street to do that without having somehow been part of DoD first. Because the services will always have that as a secondary priority. So I'm not sure you could recruit the same people in. The Army is never going to get rid of physical fitness requirements and is never going to do waivers for certain people, because if you do, you're not a soldier.
Yeah.
Right? So again, for those purposes, I don't think that this model will work. There's also real oversight issues with SOCOM having both authorities, which I don't want to get into here, but I think are real challenges because they don't have civilian oversight in the same way that the services do. It's at a much lower level, which is much more controversial. Again, I don't necessarily want to get into that debate here when we're talking about cyber forces. I think the solution to but the services will never go for the people with blue hair, and how would we make sure that would happen? I think Congress could legislate that. That would have to be part of the authorizing legislation to take that out of a DoD decision. And unfortunately, your correct point about all the trouble that Space Force is having fitting in is why you need it to be a service. I don't want there to be more services. I think we're getting towards too many. But when services are the ones that have the power in terms of organizing, training, and equipping, right, you need to be a service to play in that. And I also think you need to have a voice on the Joint Chiefs of Staff for someone who is only looking at things through the lens of cyber, because the Army Chief of Staff will never do that. I don't want an Army Chief of Staff to do that. That's not his job. But if you don't have someone with that, you're going to lose out on what may now be one of the most dominant domains of warfighting, because it enables every other aspect of warfighting.
We could pick one of the existing four and choose to disestablish that and keep the same number of services.
Speaking of really easy things to do, right? So I want a very quick yes or no from each of you on, of course, the most burning question about Space Force, and then we'll go to Q&A. So should Space Force have naval ranks? Doug.
Shoot. Yes.
Yeah. Nora.
I don't care.
David. No. I think we need Jean-Luc Picard here to answer this question for us. I have so many more issues that we could talk about that we haven't gotten to, but I want to make sure that we leave ample time for Q&A. So I think we'll go to Q&A at this point, and if we have if we've worked through all the questions from our colleagues out in the audience, then I've got more issues for the panel. But let's go to Q&A at this point.
Because we've said nothing controversial.
I don't know if you're supposed to do this as the conference organizer, but I'm doing it anyway. So one of the things, and one of the reasons why I wanted to hear this panel is because in some of my work that feels like a side project at this point, looking at kind of new technologies, it occurs to me that with the introduction of artificial intelligence, automation, hypersonic weapons, et cetera, space and communications technology, the speed of decision-making is increasing. And that is something that I have been struggling with in trying to think through what does that do to elite civil-military relations? As decisions have to be made, in much more rapid time, as sorry, when you're 8 months pregnant, walking upstairs is like a whole thing. But rapid time decision making doesn't leave a lot of room for kind of what we might think of as healthy civil military dialogue. And so I'm wondering if you have some particular insights that can help me and others kind of think through what this does to elite civ mil.
I don't know if this is an insight, but at least what I think is not the right answer. There was another recent War on the Rocks piece. But I'm one of the associate editors at the sister publication, Texas National Security Review. So yeah, read our stuff. It's good. But there was another recent War on the Rocks arguing because of the need for speed, we should use AI to automate nuclear retaliatory decision making. And that what could happen is the article proposed a new president could talk to his military advisors about here's what I would want to do. And that could work on sort of coding, specific AI decision rules and then hand over decision-making authority. So if the president says, if a missile's on the way, I want to push every button and launch, then that will happen. I don't think that's the right answer, in part because, some cynics suggested, the people who were, this is a way to get the president to sound, because here's my civil relations take. If the president doesn't give answers that sound tough in that conversation, and the senior military leaders aren't happy, it's probably going to get leaked, or at least a president, being a politician, is going to fear that it's going to get leaked, and they're going to give answers that sound tough that may not be the answers they would give when they're actually facing, if I say yes, a few tens of millions of people will die. So I thought that, I'm choosing to beat up on one little article versus giving a good answer, but I think that, people are coming up with ideas like that, and I don't think that's the right approach.
That example, when I read that article, my first thought, and it was the same first thought in answer to your question, was we've been through these debates before, right? These were the debates in the early nuclear era when it was argued that you couldn't, because an ICBM would hit Washington within, I think it was like 15 minutes of being launched, that was not enough decision time. And, what the military was pushing was pre-delegate. For the reasons it didn't happen then, I think it's not going to happen now for sound ones. But I do think that sets up likely tension, a civil military tension, because I think that's what the military, regardless of, this may have been a civilian who wrote this article, right? The military is going to want some amount of pre-delegation, and how do you, respond when there's no time to respond? And the civilians, for very understandable reasons, are not going to want to give that, because what civilian decision makers want to do is keep their options open as long as possible to gather as much information as possible before they have to make a decision. So I think that's the tension that we're going to see.
I would just want to put another little twist on Carrie's question, because I hear a lot of senior military leaders talk about how AI is going to simplify some strata or level of questions, right? We're going to let AI make all the easy decisions for us, and we're only going to have to make the more complex or sophisticated ones, which sounds really, really tempting, right? We'll do that with robots, right? Let robots do the easy things, and then we'll do the complicated things. But it begs the question of well, how then are you training, educating, decision making to be good at the complex things if you are having machines and algorithms do your simple decision making? And Riza's already told us we aren't doing a great job of educating decision making as it is. Anyway, I think there is increased requirement for us to really focus in on educating decision making, and hey, here's a problem. What do you think the right approach is? AI says this answer. Why did you come up with this different answers? How do you compare that? Because AI is going to make more and more decisions for us. There's too many incentives for it not to. I hope by policy, as Nora has said, we draw a line, right? Here are the decisions we won't let it make. But if it is going to make all these other decisions, then building those decision-making skills, I think, takes on increased importance and emphasis for us.
So a related issue here that goes along with the speed of decision point is the complexity point, right? And so when you're talking about especially something like cyber combat, right? Just the complexity of computer networks and computer codes and cyber operations and how they operate, it seems that complexity and what flows from that, which is deep expertise by your subject matter experts, right, who are in your bureaucratic organization who are doing that, right, and the probability of having senior leaders, be they senior civilians or other senior military people, right, who are in key decision-making points, but they don't have the background in the subject, right? That conversation then between your subject matter expert, right, and your non-expert decision maker, right, in any context. I mean, if you're talking about, planning naval operations, right, tough enough. But it seems like in the cyber context, right, it gets especially difficult. It seems like that's an issue, a civil military issue, right, which is relevant to this conversation we are just having about, do we need a cyber force? Does that sound right? I mean, does having a cyber force kind of address that issue, or would it make it tougher, right? Because now you'd have a military service that's completely composed of people with blue hair, who are working at 2:30 in the morning.
Or the other, right. Actually, one of my concerns when the idea of creating a Space Force came out kind of went in the other direction, that we know kind of classic bureaucratic theory, what we've seen with other services. We expect services to want to have an offensive orientation, to be able to argue that they can be an independent war-winning force. Maybe our perceptions were too colored by the Air Force as kind of the big case study of this. But so far, you actually, so I figured by now we would have Space Force all over. We need to be like dropping giant asteroids onto the Earth, and we need to have battle cruisers. That's actually not where they are. And actually, I know General Saltzman spoke at the War College last year to introducing his competitive endurance strategy. Not a very helpful phrase, but what was interesting was one of their main tenets is what they call responsible counter-space campaigning, which is very much, we will think about the second and third order consequences. Like we will, if we need to do operations in space, we'll think about how are we going to be impacting the commercial sector? How are we going to impact neutral third countries? What are we doing for long-term usability of space? Maybe that will, as you get a force that has, where you have senior leaders who grew up in Space Force instead of in the Air Force, maybe we will see, the Billy Mitchell of space. But so far in its first few years, they have not leaned into victory from space power the way that some of us thought an independent service would go towards, at least not yet.
Other questions? What about the deference question? Deference to military judgment that we're talking about earlier today. How does that operate in the context of space and cyber? Does it operate in similar ways or different, do we think?
Cyber thought?
My mind's going in two different directions at once, so you're seeing the steam, come out of my ears.
I think that's a terrific place to start. So what are the two different directions?
Part of it is that the deference question, I think, there are so many other factors that go into it that I'm not sure it varies much by domain, right? I think that is much more of a, that has much more to do with organizational politics, with military socialization, with the personalities of particular leaders and policies that help enshrine that. I was going to do this in our wrap-up, but I'll throw this in now. Ambassador Lute this morning was talking about the challenges of having a Secretary of Defense who served as a four-star general. The current and the previous one have both been that, and he talked about some of the how that led to a lot of deference to military folks with civilians not being able to speak up. I went up to him afterwards and I told him that the problem is even worse than that. If I could do one thing to improve civil-military relations, I'm sure people in this room would have lots of things they could do if they were given that magic wand. But if I got it for a moment, I would end veterans' preference in hiring at the Department of Defense. That's extremely controversial, and I don't care because people will yell at me. They've yelled at me for my ideas before. But I teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS and have amazing civilian students who want nothing more than to work for the Department of Defense, and they can't. Because if you don't have veterans preference, you cannot get hired into DoD. There are other special ways to get in. There is the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which does allow civilians to come in, and some of them get hired. The other one in the Department of Defense was the McCain Fellowship, which was essentially a PMF inside DoD. But oh, guess what? It was suspended this year because the continuing resolution meant that they weren't sure they were going to have any money for it. So you can't expect to have qualified pure civilian secretaries of defense if you don't get them into the defense space early, right? You want qualified civilians who know how to have a conversation about military topics and who have the knowledge to push back because they know what they're talking about, to have a serious conversation about the use of military force, not just, well, I don't like that, give me more options, or whatever it is. So I actually see that not just as a Secretary of Defense level issue, but all levels of civilians. I also think that having retired generals serve as Secretaries of Defense sends exactly the wrong signal about military people acceding to civilian views. And I think it was particularly pronounced under the previous Secretary of Defense, who once looked me straight in the eye. I've been doing this for 25 years. I kind of know what I'm talking about. Looked me straight in the eye and said, why should I listen to you about anything you haven't served in combat? And I happened to mention that there was this thing called a constitution that is involved and that civilian control over the military is very important. But I know a lot of people who believe that, and that helped set that tone in some very damaging ways.
I'll just say, yell at me too, because I agree with that point. Where maybe it is worse with things like space and cyber is just they have the combination of being so specialized and technical in many respects, and especially so extremely classified and often overclassified, that it certainly becomes a thing to say, well, if you had a clearance and you knew what I knew, you wouldn't make any of those arguments. I'm a professor. That's kind of making an argument and having people tell me I'm wrong is kind of what I do. I can see how a political appointee might with an actual policy on the line as opposed to points in a debate. You can imagine they may be uncomfortable not deferring with on an issue where they may not have the technical chops and this is just so classified, you have to take my word for it. So I think those areas may be prone to more of that deference, just because the civilian side, particularly civilians who are not retired military or who haven't had a job in the system the whole time can find it difficult to, arguing from a real disadvantage.
I think that's a really important point, because secrecy obviously can enable, things, such, concealment of development of exquisite capabilities, development of plans, basically doesn't tip off the bad guys, right? That's the big advantage of secrecy. Another big advantage of secrecy is it creates deliberation space, right? Which is outside the public realm and all the scrutiny that comes with it, and the hijacking of the issues and becoming very, very political, especially in our really, really overheated political climate, right? So secrecy has really practical values. Absolutely. That's why we have so much of it. But secrecy also has civil military problems, right? Secrecy has democracy problems. I wonder too, if in the context of talking about tech, industry, and the future of war and our capabilities, right? Does secrecy create a problem actually for developing the capabilities that we need of having industry being positioned in a responsive way, right? To meet the needs that we've got. Doug, sounds like you are agreeing with that thought.
I do. I agree very strongly. One additional place it really complicates things is our ability to work with allies and partners. Yeah. Every sense of how we want to be able to advance our interests in this world is we want to do it with allies and partners. Heaven forbid we have to fight. We want to fight with allies and partners. That substantially amplifies our capabilities. But when we guard these things so tightly, so concretely, it really impedes that level of coordination. And so each one of these areas has got to be adjudicated specifically on its merits. But my gut tells me that we are guarding some things a bit too tightly and losing opportunity that we would gain by incorporating our partners in a more holistic way.
I would say we overclassify everything. So, let's start from that premise. Industry is the one area where it doesn't concern me that the overclassification will inhibit discussions, because it's not hard for people in defense industry to get the right clearances if they're in the right programs. And
That's
frankly,
right.
they're mostly populated by people who come out of those programs in the military to begin with. So I'm not worried about the classification issue and access for industry. I think it's everywhere else where you have these problems with allies and partners, with information sharing with other U.S. government agencies, with the decision-making space of political leaders as well.
I think the one place I've seen that it's not true, with our primes, it's very much true. If you're a prime and you're working on a system and it needs to be classified, they've got all the systems to make that happen. But I think one of the real strengths of the U.S. is what happens in its small businesses. I think that's where so much innovation happens. And for a small company to then be able to break into that
But
classified
they can't work
space.
for DoD anyway, because they can't get themselves on the GSA and deal with 2-year lags. So you are actually, it's a great point, but there's so much else that's stacked against
Although
them.
I'm trying to remember if this was the Space Industrial Base or the overall Defense Industrial Base report that came out recently. The authors actually expressed some surprise, or maybe it was a RAND report. The authors expressed some surprise actually at how much weight companies put on clearances as opposed to some of the other contracting issues. The inability to even read the RFP without clearances,
That's
or
right.
the fact that they couldn't get need to know until they had a contract. But of course, you can't get a contract if you can't respond on a classified basis. So the startup type companies, they actually, even more than the valley of death contracting issues, said clearances were just absolutely killing them. And related to that also, DoD rules about cyber, maybe, and here, I don't know enough about cybersecurity to know whether I should be on the side of DoD or the companies, but just the sheer amount of documentation and compliance needed for DoD cyber rules was just crushing for a small business.
So General Lute was making the point earlier about how in a command economy, authoritative regimes can produce a lot of things really fast, right? They can direct all those resources, but they aren't great at the innovation piece, right? Innovation is going to be what gives us a asymmetric advantage, and that is happening not in great big huge firms most of the time. And so figuring out how we build systems that incorporate innovative ideas from across society, I think, is a really important challenge for us to dive into.
And the primes will, they will find and buy those small companies and maybe use them well, maybe not. I mean, the example, it's not a tech issue actually, but that I come to of where that was just painful. The human terrain system, a GWAT era program where we were going to bring in anthropologists and send them to, and other social scientists, send them to Iraq and Afghanistan. Originated at Fort Leavenworth, where it turned out there was a blanket contract with BAE that all social science things had all contracts. BAE had right of first refusal. BAE took this. You can imagine how much BAE knew about hiring PhD anthropologists. They found some retired 06s with enough of a resume, and this, frankly, the program really dramatically underperformed because BAE had no idea how to run a social science program.
Well, we are just about at the end of our time for this panel. I wanted to thank our panelists for their very insightful comments on a wide variety of issues which concern tech and industry, modern war, and civil military relations. And I also want to say a word of thanks to all of you for what you do every day, which is you are somebody who is a professional and you're somebody who's invested in public service. If you're teaching, you're in public service. Obviously, if you're wearing the uniform, you're in public service. If you're a civilian, serving our country as well. And being a professional and being a public servant is enormously important in any context. It's especially important in the context in which we all live, when institution after institution, government institutions, private sector, civic institutions, you look at the polling data, public regard for them has cratered, every single one. It used to be the military was the only one that hadn't cratered, and that has started to crater in recent years. That's our civil military context, right? American civic culture is discrediting institutions, and it's also discrediting the entire notion of expertise, right? And that people who have expertise and who are, members of professional guilds, right, and have the training and have the certification and the credentialing and the ethical responsibilities that go with being a professional, right? These have also been discredited on, and I see it, working with my students. It's a bipartisan phenomenon, right? And I find that enormously worrisome. And people who are professionals and experts and public servants are under enormous scrutiny and criticism, and a lot of it is just wild. Some of it is fair, a lot of it is just unhinged. And so in that context, I just wanted to say a word of thank you to each of you for your professionalism and for your commitment to our country. So with that, thank you to our panel.